Imagine waking up to the sound of drums, cannon fire, and the ground shaking beneath your feet. The sky above Vienna was blackened with smoke, its walls trembling under relentless bombardment. Inside the city, priests clutched their crosses, mothers held their children, and soldiers whispered their last prayers. At the gates stood the Ottoman Empire, an unstoppable force that had swallowed kingdoms and crushed empires for centuries. Now, they were ready to deliver the final blow, not just to Vienna, but to the very heart of Europe. But here's the haunting question. What if the walls had fallen? What if the crescent banner had risen over Vienna? Would Paris, Rome, even London have been next? The year was 1683. The Ottoman Empire stretched like a shadow across 3 continents, its banners flying over deserts, seas, and mountains. From North Africa to the heart of the Middle East, from the Balkans to the very gates of Vienna, their power seemed unstoppable. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the Ottomans were more than an enemy. They were a nightmare. And Europe itself was fractured. Kings squabbling with kings, princes plotting against princes, each more interested in their own crown than in defending Christendom. Vienna stood as the last barrier, a single city against the might of an empire. And yet, while its citizens clung to hope, few realized the storm was not just coming. It was already here, thundering at their walls. At the head of the Ottoman juggernaut stood Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man as brilliant as he was ruthless, driven by one consuming dream, to plant the crescent banner in the heart of Europe. To him, Vienna was not just a city of stone and walls. It was the gateway. Conquer it, and the road to Rome, Paris, and beyond would lie open. He marched with nearly 200,000 men, a sea of soldiers stretching across the horizon. Cannons, cavalry, and janissaries, the finest shock troops of the empire, encircled Vienna like a tightening noose. Every day, the earth shook as his artillery pounded the city, tearing holes in its walls. Inside, Vienna's fate rested on Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. With barely 15,000 defenders, he faced an impossible choice: surrender and watch his city fall, or fight to the last breath. Starhemberg chose defiance. He patched crumbling walls, armed civilians, and swore Vienna would not fall while he still drew breath. But outside the city's gates, a darker game was unfolding. Europe's rulers hesitated. Some feared the Ottomans more than they hated them. Others feared their neighbors even more than the Sultan. Letters flew across courts, pleas for aid, promises of betrayal, whispers of delay. And yet, the question hung heavy over every day of the siege. Would help arrive before the walls gave way, or would Vienna be left to die alone? Summer dragged into autumn. Vienna was a city on its knees. Food was gone. Citizens chewed on rats, dogs, even scraps of leather just to survive. Disease swept through the narrow streets, turning hunger into horror. Every night, the sky lit up with fire as Ottoman shells smashed into walls, collapsing towers and burying families beneath the rubble. Children wept. Soldiers, exhausted and broken, began to whisper that the end was near. And outside the gates, Kara Mustafa's men dug tunnels beneath the walls, filling them with explosives. One more push, and Vienna would crumble. But then, when all hope seemed lost, a twist. From the north, dust rose on the horizon. An army was coming. Not just any army, but a coalition of Christian forces, Germans, Austrians, and Poles. And at its head rode Jan III Sobieski, the legendary king of Poland, a commander feared by the Ottomans, revered by his men. Sobieski's arrival was a miracle, and yet, fate balanced on a knife's edge. What if he had marched a week later? What if he had never come at all? Would Vienna have fallen, its cross torn down and replaced by the crescent of the Ottomans? And if that had happened, would the very map of Europe look the same today? September 12, 1683, the day that would decide the fate of Europe. At dawn, silence hung over the battlefield. Then the earth shook as tens of thousands of soldiers collided, steel against steel, cannon fire echoing across the valleys. the air filled with smoke so thick it choked the lungs, screams mixing with the roar of drums and muskets. For hours, the fighting raged. The Ottomans pressed hard, determined to break Vienna once and for all. Kara Mustafa watched from his command tent. Certain victory was only moments away. Inside the city, Starhemberg's men clung to the walls, barely holding on, each minute feeling like eternity. But then, the hills to the north came alive. A sight so terrifying, so thunderous, it burned itself into history. King Jan Sobieski unleashed his secret weapon, the winged hussars. They appeared like an avalanche of men and horses, their armor gleaming in the sunlight, their great wings strapped to their backs, whistling and roaring like thunder. 12,000 cavalry descended at once, the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. The ground trembled beneath their hooves. The sound was like a storm breaking the sky. They smashed into the Ottoman lines with unstoppable force, slicing through ranks that had once seemed invincible. Panic spread. Soldiers who had marched undefeated for centuries now broke and fled. Kara Mustafa stood frozen, watching as the dream of conquering Europe dissolved in a single, breathtaking moment. The crowd fell silent. The world held its breath. And what happened next shocked even his closest allies. The siege was broken. After 2 long months of terror, Vienna still stood, bloodied, scarred, but unbowed. Its people stumbled through streets littered with rubble, corpses, and shattered cannons, too exhausted to celebrate, yet alive against all odds. For the Ottomans, it was a humiliation unlike any before. An army that had once terrified the world was forced into retreat. The myth of Ottoman invincibility shattered in a single day. And Kara Mustafa Pasha, the architect of the siege, paid the price. He returned not in triumph, but in disgrace. The Sultan demanded an answer for failure. In the cold silence of Belgrade, Kara Mustafa was executed, strangled with a silk cord, the fate reserved for those who disappointed the empire. For Europe, the battle was more than a victory. It was a turning point. Kingdoms that once distrusted each other now saw the power of unity. The tide of Ottoman expansion, unstoppable for centuries, had reached its limit. But every triumph leaves scars. For the Ottomans, Vienna marked the beginning of decline. For Europe, it was the beginning of a new age of dominance, yet one built on blood, fear, and centuries of war still to come. The echoes of that September day would haunt both empires long after the cannons fell silent. So, was September 12th, 1683 the day Europe was truly saved, or merely a pause in an endless clash between East and West? Vienna's walls held. But what if they hadn't? Imagine the crescent banner flying not just over Vienna, but over Paris, Rome, perhaps even London. Would the Renaissance have been crushed? Would the world we know today even exist? History gives us one answer. The Ottomans were stopped. But the shadows of that battle still whisper. Was this Europe's greatest victory, or the Ottoman Empire's greatest mischance? The debate still rages, and maybe, just maybe, the fate of the world was decided in those few desperate hours on a September morning.